Victor Stone, a self-assured billionaire, accepted a dare that would completely flip his life in ways he never saw coming. Accustomed to winning in every arena, whether in business, life, or any contest, his competitive nature burned bright. One night at a swanky New York party, his close friend Derek tossed out a bold challenge. With a sly grin, Derek said, "Victor, I bet you wouldn't have the guts to marry a nurse who isn't your usual type." Known for dating only glamorous women, Victor was stunned, yet his need to prove himself kicked in immediately. He arched an eyebrow and asked, "So what's the reward?" Derek, raising his glass, replied, $1 million if you win, but you must wed her and stay married for at least 6 months. Thrilled by the idea of a daring contest and a hefty payout, Victor jumped in without hesitation. The nurse Derek had in mind was Nancy Roberts, a woman who, despite being overweight, worked as a dedicated nurse and challenged every conventional idea of beauty. Victor didn't know much about her, but to him, it was just another challenge to conquer. A few days later, Victor learned more about Nancy. She was confident, independent, and headstrong, nothing like the women he was used to. This only made him more curious. Always in charge, he wondered how he would handle someone who wouldn't simply bend to his will. Their first meeting was arranged at an upscale restaurant. When Nancy arrived, Victor immediately noticed how different she was from anyone he had met before. Unfazed by the posh surroundings or by him, she locked eyes with him steadily. "You must be Victor Stone," she said plainly as she sat down, and Victor responded with a cool smile, extending his hand. After a brief pause, she shook it firmly, showing unmistakable resolve. "Let's cut to the chase," Nancy said bluntly. "I know why we're here. I know all about the wager and every one of its conditions." Victor was taken aback by her straightforwardness but kept his composure. "Yet you agreed to meet me," he said, genuinely curious about her reasons. Nancy paused, then replied, "Let's just say I have my own reasons. I'm no fool. 6 months might seem short, but a lot can change. If you think you can control me, you're sorely mistaken." Victor grinned, realizing that Nancy was already proving to be a challenge far beyond his usual encounters, a challenge that made the game even more enticing. By the time they left, Victor found himself increasingly drawn to Nancy. She was unlike anyone he'd ever met, unafraid to stand up for herself. She even sparked a sense of admiration in him. Over the next few days, Victor mulled over his next move. He was used to calling all the shots, but now it appeared that Nancy had her own way of doing things. Their second meeting was set in a casual cafe, a stark contrast to the high-end restaurants Victor normally frequented. Nancy had chosen the spot, and Victor, still intrigued, agreed to it. He wanted to understand who she really was and why she'd signed on for what looked like a temporary marriage contract. When Victor arrived, Nancy was already there, sipping tea with a relaxed smile. She greeted him warmly, without the cold edge of their first encounter. Yet she still carried herself with that unyielding confidence. "I thought you preferred a fancy restaurant," she teased as Victor sat down. "Sometimes you just need to mix it up," Victor replied, trying to sound laid back, despite feeling slightly off balance. They exchanged small talk for a while before Nancy got straight to the point. "If we're going through with this, there are a few things you should know," she said, setting her tea down. "I'm not interested in your money or your flashy lifestyle. 6 months is 6 months, and I plan to walk away exactly as I came." Victor studied her, recognizing the honesty in her tone. Nancy was the type of person who knew exactly what she wanted, and she didn't see marriage as a stepping stone for climbing the social ladder. "So, what do you want?" Victor asked, genuinely curious. "I want my freedom," Nancy replied without hesitation. "Even though we're entering this arrangement, I'm not going to let you control me. I have my own life, and that isn't changing just because of a temporary union." Victor smiled. Although it wasn't the answer he expected, he didn't mind her insistence on independence. To him, the marriage was merely a tool to win the bet. "Okay," Victor agreed. "After 6 months, we go our separate ways. Nancy looked at him for a moment, as if making sure he truly meant it. She had taken on this dare with a clear plan and was determined to steer things her way. Deep down, she suspected Victor might try to manipulate the situation, but she trusted her own strength to stand her ground. Their meeting ended on friendly terms. With both understanding their roles, Nancy would remain independent, and Victor would treat the marriage as nothing more than a temporary challenge. Yet, as the wedding day drew near, Victor couldn't shake the feeling that this game was far more complicated than he had anticipated. The wedding itself was a no-frills, business-like affair, more like signing a contract than a celebration. Victor, with his calculated mindset, already saw himself as the clear winner of the bet. He was convinced that the 6 months would pass in a flash, and that Nancy, stubborn as she was, would eventually yield to the luxurious lifestyle he intended to offer her. Immediately after the ceremony, Victor whisked Nancy off to his sprawling penthouse in the heart of New York, a true showcase of his wealth. Floor-to-ceiling glass windows reflected the city's lights, and every inch of the place boasted the most exclusive, expensive furnishings. To Victor, this was the real arena where he would win Nancy over with his material charm. However, the moment Nancy stepped into his penthouse, she made it abundantly clear that she wasn't about to give in. Instead of looking impressed, she maintained a defiant air. 6 months, Victor. Not 1 day more, she declared firmly, as she walked over to one of the large windows, staring out at the city with complete indifference to the luxury around her. Victor smirked confidently. He was used to such resistance. In his past, every woman had eventually fallen for his charm and riches, but Nancy, he assumed, would be no different. In the early days after the wedding, Victor tried everything to win Nancy over. He showered her with expensive jewelry, designer clothes, and extravagant trips, expecting that Nancy would eventually adapt to the lifestyle he dictated. Instead, she rejected every lavish offer. Nancy stuck to her simple, modest routine and refused the trappings of wealth. "I don't need any of these things, Victor," she would say calmly, a tone that only made him more irritated. It hurt him deeply. Victor was used to always getting his way, and now his authority was being challenged for the very first time. The contest had grown beyond a simple dare. It was personal. He felt compelled to conquer her, to prove that he was still in charge. That's when he started playing rougher. He tried to stop her from going to work by insisting that she didn't need a paycheck, or reminding her that her only role was being his wife. When Nancy objected, he forced her to wait for hours for appointments she believed were important. Victor manipulated schedules and situations in every way possible to maintain his control, but Nancy remained unyielding, a rock that only spurred him to try even harder to break through. Their relationship soon became a minefield, with even the smallest disagreement igniting fierce debates, as Nancy deftly shot down every attempt Victor made to make her feel inferior or controlled. One particularly heated evening, Victor, exasperated and desperate for a breakthrough, tried a more emotional approach. "I just can't figure you out, Nancy," he said, looking at her with a mix of frustration and genuine curiosity. "Any other woman would be thrilled to live in this kind of luxury, but you act like it isn't enough. What is it that you really want?" For the first time, Nancy lifted her eyes, which shone with an intensity Victor hadn't expected. "What do I want?" "I want respect, Victor. I'm not just a piece on your board. You think you can buy control with money, but that's not how it works. Money can't purchase dignity or self-worth. You might have all the wealth in the world, but inside you're empty, and that's something you refuse to see." Her words hit him like a ton of bricks. For the first time, Victor felt the sting of possibly losing more than just control. Nancy wasn't merely resisting his influence. She was breaking down the very mask he'd worn for years, and that frightened him. No one had ever challenged him in such a raw, honest way, and the fact that Nancy saw right through his facade left him feeling exposed. Yet instead of backing off, Victor resolved to tighten his grip. He began scheming ways to isolate Nancy, convinced that without him, her life would fall apart. He cut off her contacts, blocked any opportunities that might help her grow, and even sabotaged events she organized. But Nancy was not one to be bullied easily. With every attempt Victor made to assert his control, she only grew more determined, clinging fiercely to her dignity and refusing to be molded by his expectations. Then one night, Nancy decided to flip the script. "Victor, you really think you're in charge, don't you?" she said coolly. "But what you don't understand is that I've got my own plan, and when the time comes, you're going to see that this whole game is way bigger than you ever imagined." Victor stared at her, surprised. For the first time, he realized he might have underestimated Nancy, and a creeping fear told him that he might not end up as the winner after all. Days passed, each one stretching out like a tightly coiled rope until the tension felt ready to snap. Obsessed with keeping control, Victor tried every trick he could to steer things his way. But Nancy remained as unyielding as ever. With every failed attempt, her inner strength only shone brighter. And yet, over time, Victor began to see Nancy in a new light. It wasn't just about her resilience anymore. It was something deeper. She was slowly breaking down his emotional walls in a way no other woman ever had, and that unsettled him. For the first time, he started to see her not just as an opponent in a dare, but as a real person he wanted to understand. After a particularly intense argument one night, Victor found himself alone in his spacious living room, staring out at the New York skyline through enormous glass windows. The city lights, which once made him feel powerful, now seemed hollow and empty. He wondered why he felt so lost. Nancy was just the woman he had married on a dare, a pawn in his game, or so he thought. But deep down, she was stirring emotions in him that he had never experienced before. The man who prided himself on controlling his every feeling now found himself vulnerable, as Nancy effortlessly saw through his carefully constructed persona. As the distance between them grew with each passing day, Victor felt an invisible barrier that tormented him relentlessly. He wasn't sure if it was pride or fear of losing control, but something about Nancy pulled him in like nothing else ever had. One night, during a casual dinner with Derek, the friend who had thrown down the dare, Derek remarked, "Victor, you're always on top of things, but it looks like this nurse is really giving you a run for your money." Victor forced a smile, unable to immediately respond. He hated to admit it, but he knew things were changing. That night, determined to clear his head, Victor came home with a resolve to fix things. He needed to remind himself that this marriage was just a contract, a game. When he stepped into his penthouse, he found Nancy on the couch, absorbed in a book and oblivious to his presence. "Can we talk?" he asked, breaking the heavy silence that had become routine. Nancy calmly looked up, closed her book, and met his gaze with a quiet, attentive look. "Sure," she replied, as if she had been waiting for him all along. Victor sat down across from her, struggling to find the right words. The tension was thick between them, and he realized he couldn't treat this union as just a formality anymore. Something was shifting. "What are we doing here, Nancy?" he asked sincerely. "We started this as a dare, a game, but now I'm not so sure." Nancy studied him for a few seconds before answering. "I'm not playing, Victor. I never was." Her tone was calm, yet heavy with meaning. "From the very beginning, I agreed to this marriage for reasons beyond just you. I'm not interested in your money or your controlling ways. I'm here for something much bigger, and if you haven't caught on yet, maybe it's time you did." Victor felt a knot tighten in his chest, as if she were revealing a secret he couldn't quite grasp. Frustration welled up inside him. "I know you have your own secrets, Nancy, but what really bothers me is that the more I try to understand you, the more I see that I'm not in charge, and I can't stand that." Abruptly, he stood up, unable to remain still, as if the weight of her words was too much to bear. Nancy, still calm, rose and walked toward him, stopping just a few inches away. Her presence made his heart race. "Victor," she said softly, "this isn't about control. You've always tried to dominate everything and everyone, but with me, you'll have to learn that control isn't always the answer. Sometimes, things just are." Looking into her eyes, Victor felt a connection he'd never experienced before, as if, for the first time, he was truly seeing Nancy for who she was, not merely as a piece in his game. "So, what do you really want?" he whispered. With a small, mysterious smile, Nancy replied, "I want you to figure that out for yourself." And with that, she walked away, leaving him alone with his swirling thoughts. In the days that followed, although the gap between them seemed to widen, Victor began to feel closer to Nancy than ever before. He became obsessed with uncovering her secret and understanding her true intentions, all while feeling as though he was gradually losing control of himself. Deep inside, he didn't want to admit it, but Nancy was changing his world in ways that both excited and terrified him. The 6-month period was nearly over, yet to Victor each day stretched on endlessly. He barely slept, tormented by the looming truth he felt was just around the corner. Nancy had become a mysterious force in his life, no longer just the nurse. He married on a dare, but someone who held a truth he desperately wanted to know. In his quest for answers, Victor even hired private investigators, dug into every part of her past, and chased every lead, but everything was meticulously arranged by Nancy. It was as if she was always several steps ahead, controlling the game from the very start. One night, after a long day at work, Victor returned home later than usual. He noticed a light on the balcony and saw Nancy sitting there, gazing out over the city like a queen surveying her realm. He felt that tonight might be the night he finally got the answers he craved, but the thought of what he might learn made his throat tighten. He moved slowly toward her, his footsteps echoing in the quiet space. Nancy didn't immediately turn to face him. The air was heavy, as if both sensed something monumental was about to unfold. "I need some answers, Nancy," Victor said firmly, though his heart pounded. "I can't keep playing this game. You have to tell me the truth." Nancy exhaled, slowly, then stood up and turned to him. Her eyes, usually calm and calculating, now flickered with an emotion Victor couldn't quite identify. A dark, fierce intensity that sent shivers down his spine. "The truth, Victor?" she said with a bitter smile, folding her arms. "Are you sure you want to know it?" He nodded, and the tension in the room grew with each second. Victor braced himself for whatever she was about to reveal, and then, in a voice as cold as ice, Nancy said, "You have no idea who I really am. You've always treated people like pieces on a board, but this time, Victor, you were the piece I moved all along." A chill ran through him as his once unbreakable sense of control began to crumble. He tried to speak, but Nancy continued. "Do you remember the name Roberts?" she added sharply. "Of course not. You never pay attention. My father ran a small clinic that barely survived until you stepped in and crushed it." Victor recoiled, as memories of his ruthless deals and the lives he'd wrecked came rushing back. "What are you saying?" he stammered, confusion and worry evident in his voice. Nancy stepped closer, her eyes blazing with anger and sorrow. "My father, Victor, he was a good man, trying to keep our family afloat until you took everything away. You ruined him, and because of that, he ended his life." The flood of memories, of deals made at the expense of people's lives, hit Victor hard as Nancy's voice cracked with emotion. "My father took his own life because of your empire, your relentless pursuit of success at any cost. You stole him from me, the only person I ever truly had, while my mother and I sank into despair and poverty. You lived a life of luxury while we struggled to survive." Victor stood there, stunned into silence, overwhelmed by the crushing weight of guilt. He opened his mouth to defend himself, but no words came. All he could do was stand there, the realization of his actions seeping into every fiber of his being. "But I planned this," Nancy continued, her voice regaining control despite the pain. "When I heard about your dare, I saw an opportunity to make you feel even a fraction of what I endured. I purposely joined this challenge so that you'd experience what it's like to be manipulated, to be left powerless." Victor's body trembled as he realized the tables had completely turned. He, who always thought he was in control, was now the target. "Victor," Nancy began again, her voice soft with emotion. I never expected you to be so blind. You never cared. You kept destroying lives without a second thought. Now, I'm not here to obliterate you entirely, but to ensure that you never forget the pain you caused. I want you to feel that pain every single day so that it haunts you forever." Her words struck him like a final verdict. Victor felt as if he were collapsing under the weight of his guilt. He had lost far more than a simple bet. He had lost something he could never regain. Nancy then stepped back, leaving a suffocating silence behind her. Victor's legs buckled, and he sank onto his couch, left speechless and drowning in emptiness. Nancy's revelations echoed in his mind like a storm, shattering everything he thought he knew. The nurse he once saw as just a tool in his game had turned the tables completely, leaving him utterly out of control. Nancy didn't give him time to recover. After unloading the painful truth about her father's shattered life and tragic end, she walked away, leaving Victor alone with his crushing remorse. He stood there, frozen, as if the air itself were closing in on him. He longed to speak, to apologize or explain the unexplainable, but no words emerged. In the days that followed, Nancy did exactly what Victor feared most. She completely ignored him. Her very presence became a constant reminder of his failure. She passed him by as though he were invisible, and every encounter left him feeling more isolated. At breakfast, she sat in silence, barely glancing his way when he tried to speak. His attempts at conversation vanished into the heavy air between them. Victor, once used to being the center of attention, now found himself ignored in his own home. The silence was unbearable, slowly chipping away at the man he once was. One morning, as Victor tried once more to reach out, he said, "We need to talk." But Nancy continued to face away from him, adjusting her coat, and the silence between them grew even heavier. Victor waited anxiously. For any response, a word, even a shout, would have been better than her icy indifference. Instead, Nancy simply walked out, quietly closing the door behind her, leaving him with nothing but the echo and the pain of being utterly disregarded by someone he was beginning to see as more than just an opponent. Victor, accustomed to winning and being in control, now found himself punished by her silence and deliberate disdain. Every time she left him alone, the feeling of powerlessness deepened, and that was only the start. Nancy didn't stop at silence. She began chipping away at Victor's confidence in small yet agonizing ways. At work, important meetings were suddenly rescheduled without notice, his decisions were questioned, and projects he'd initiated inexplicably began to fail. Victor knew deep down that these setbacks were Nancy's doing, even though she never admitted it. It was as if she were pulling invisible strings, undermining his authority at every turn. At home, the situation worsened. Nancy deliberately distanced herself from any of Victor's attempts to fix their relationship. She stopped joining him at meals and avoided any conversation beyond the bare minimum. Whenever Victor tried to bridge the gap, her cold stares made it clear that his presence was nothing more than an unwelcome interruption. One quiet evening, Victor found Nancy in the living room, absorbed in a book. Although the scene appeared calm, he sensed an underlying trap in the stillness. He sat down on the couch and tried once more to break the silence. "Nancy," he said softly, almost pleadingly, "I know I've done terrible things. I know I've hurt you, but can we try to fix this? Can we at least talk?" Slowly, Nancy closed her book without even looking up. When she finally did, her face was so cold it sent a shiver down his spine. "Talk?" she repeated with a bitter laugh. "Do you really think there's anything left to say after all this?" Victor pleaded. "After everything, words feel pointless." "I was wrong, Nancy. I truly am. I would do anything to make this right. I can change. I promise." She finally looked at him, her eyes piercing as if daring him to back up his promises. "Change?" she said slowly. "Do you really think changing now will erase everything? Will it bring my father back, or fix all the misery we suffered because of you?" "No, Victor, it won't," she replied, stepping even closer, and he felt himself sinking under the intensity of her gaze. "What you do next isn't for me, it's for you. You're going to carry this guilt for the rest of your life." Victor stood in stunned silence, realizing that no quick fix or instant forgiveness was coming his way. He longed to mend what he had broken, but Nancy seemed beyond repair. In the days that followed, Nancy's cold treatment only grew harsher. Every time Victor passed her, he was met with looks of disgust, and his frustration turned into sheer desperation. He tried every possible way to show that he was changing, that he wanted to be a better person, but every attempt was met with indifference or sarcasm. One night, after a disastrous meeting at work where a major project was inexplicably sabotaged, Victor returned home to find Nancy on the phone, laughing. He caught bits and pieces of her conversation and realized she was criticizing his decisions at work. It was unmistakably her doing. Nancy was dismantling everything he had built, all in such a subtle, calculated manner that only he could see her hand in it. After she hung up, Victor sat alone in the living room, his face a mix of exhaustion, anger, and deep sorrow. "You're tearing everything apart, aren't you?" he said quietly, his tone heavy with frustration. "You're ruining my life." Nancy looked at him with an expression of cold detachment, crossing her arms. "Ruin your life?" she echoed, raising an eyebrow. "I'm just giving you back what you handed out. Don't worry, Victor. I'm not going to ruin you financially. That would be too simple. I want you to feel the pain. I want you to experience every loss, just as I did. I want you to see everything you built crumble, and know it's all because of you." Victor felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath him. This was his worst nightmare. He, who always had everything under control, was now being methodically dismantled by a calculated revenge. Nancy wasn't out to destroy him all at once. She wanted him to suffer, bit by bit, until nothing was left but regret. Weeks passed, and Nancy's silent punishment continued unabated. Victor, once full of confidence, wandered around his home like a ghost, desperately trying to earn forgiveness that he knew would never come. Every attempt to redeem himself seemed futile, trapping him in a relentless cycle of guilt and sorrow, a cycle that Nancy controlled perfectly. But the worst was yet to come. One night, Nancy finally confronted him again, this time with a coldness Victor had never seen before. Approaching him as he sat, exhausted and broken, she spoke words that would haunt him forever. "Victor, you took something from me that I will never get back," she said in a clear, sharp voice. "Now I'm giving you back your due, and you'll carry this with you for the rest of your life." With those words, Nancy turned and left. Him, the punishment, already set in motion. Victor felt trapped in a maze of guilt and despair. He was no longer the confident, arrogant man who thought he controlled everything. He was reduced to a shadow of his former self. Every time he tried to speak with Nancy, he was met with cold stares and outright rejection. He couldn't sleep. His mind only focused on how to fix the damage he'd done, yet the weight of his past made that seem impossible. Slowly, though, something began to change in Victor. He realized that empty apologies and hollow words meant nothing. What Nancy needed was real, tangible change. Determined, he woke up one morning with a renewed sense of purpose. He understood he couldn't simply ask for forgiveness. He had to show it through his actions. The first step was to give Nancy the space she needed. to prove that he respected her time and wouldn't force himself upon her. At the same time, he made sure to remain subtly present. Victor began to notice the little things that made Nancy happy. He observed her daily routines, her favorite things, like how she loved peonies and preferred her coffee strong with no sugar. These details, once trivial, now became the cornerstone of his plan to reconnect with her. That same afternoon, Victor visited one of the best flower shops in town and picked out a bouquet of peonies. Instead of handing them to Nancy directly, knowing she might brush them off, he left them on the kitchen table with no note. A simple, heartfelt gesture. He waited nervously as she went out for a walk. When Nancy returned and discovered the flowers, she didn't say a word. But Victor noticed her pause and pick one up to smell it. To him, that small act signified progress. In the following days, Victor continued these small gestures. He prepared her favorite strong coffee in the morning, set the breakfast table just the way she liked it, and then quietly left, ensuring he wasn't imposing. He left little touches that spoke of care, all without forcing any interaction. Slowly, he hoped to show that he had truly changed, that he genuinely cared for Nancy. Yet, she still kept her distance, her wall remaining firm, even as Victor vowed never to give up, determined to win her back on her terms. One chilly evening, as Nancy sat on the balcony wrapped in a blanket, watching the city lights, Victor approached her with a cup of hot tea, knowing she liked something warm before bed. "I thought you might like this," he said softly, careful not to intrude. Nancy didn't speak at first, but eventually accepted the tea, her eyes still fixed on the skyline. Victor stood quietly by her side, simply being present without pushing for conversation. For the first time in weeks, the silence between them wasn't unbearable. It felt like a small breakthrough. "Why are you doing this, Victor?" Nancy finally asked, her voice gentle yet firm. Victor took a deep breath before replying. "Because I realized that talking alone won't fix anything. My words mean nothing compared to real change. I want to be a better person, not just for you, but because I know I must change." Nancy remained silent for a few more seconds as the cold wind brushed past them, then said softly, "You can't change the past, Victor." He responded earnestly, "I know, but I can change the future." That night, as they shared that quiet moment, Victor saw a hint of something new in Nancy's eyes, a spark of curiosity beneath her guarded exterior. She wasn't ready to fully forgive him yet, but that small glimmer gave him hope. In the days that followed, Victor's small gestures continued, and the energy between him and Nancy slowly began to shift. Although she still kept her guard, she no longer outright rejected his efforts. She accepted the flowers, the tea, and even allowed him to join her briefly during breakfast. Little by little, the walls between them began to crumble. The real test came one evening when Victor was about to leave for a business meeting. Dressed smartly and ready to head out, he was startled when Nancy suddenly appeared with an unreadable look. "Can you cancel your meeting?" she asked unexpectedly. Victor was taken aback. She had never before shown any interest in his schedule. After a brief pause, he nodded and canceled his meeting without hesitation. It was the first time in weeks that Nancy seemed willing to spend time with him, and Victor wasn't about to let that chance slip away. They sat together on the couch, a little apart, yet the silence now felt less oppressive. Thoughtfully, Nancy finally said, "I'm not ready to fully forgive you, Victor, but I see that you're really trying. Maybe this is the start of something new." Victor's heart raced at her words. He knew the road ahead would be long, but even a small step was enough to keep his hope alive. That night, as they talked about everyday things, Victor felt a small victory. He was slowly rebuilding a connection with Nancy, and she was no longer an untouchable figure in his eyes. However, he sensed that she was still hiding something, a secret she wasn't ready to reveal. Then, On one quiet night with gentle rain, tapping on his penthouse windows, Victor noticed that Nancy seemed even more pensive and distant than usual. He fought the urge to push her, but his curiosity eventually got the better of him. "Nancy," he said softly, almost hesitantly, "I feel like there's something you're not telling me. If you're holding something back, I need to know." Sitting on the couch with her hands folded in her lap, Nancy took a deep breath and avoided his gaze for a long, painful moment. The silence stretched on until she finally looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of pain and determination. "You're right, Victor," she said quietly, her voice heavy with emotion. "I've been keeping something inside, a truth I never thought I could share until now. But maybe it's time." Victor felt the air grow thick as he leaned in, both dreading and anticipating what was coming next. "Do you remember the clinic my father ran? The one you completely crushed?" Nancy began in a firm tone, laced with deep hurt. "I already told you that you ruined our family, and that's true. But it goes even further. You destroyed more than just a clinic." Victor looked at her, confused and worried. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice full of concern. Nancy lowered her eyes, tears threatening to spill. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I was pregnant, Victor." Those words hit him like a sledgehammer. He blinked in shock, struggling to process what he had just heard. "I was pregnant," he murmured, his voice trembling. "At the time when everything fell apart, when we lost everything, and after. My father was gone. The pressure was too much and I lost the baby." Victor felt as if the world had collapsed around him. He could barely catch his breath as the full impact of her revelation sank in. The guilt he'd been drowning in suddenly deepened. He had not only destroyed a business and a family, but also a potential life. "Nancy," he managed to choke out, I never imagined." His voice faltered. Nancy finally looked up, tears streaming down her face. Yet there was a quiet strength in her expression. "You never cared, Victor," she said, her voice raw with hurt. "You kept destroying lives without a second thought. I lost my baby, and you went on with your life like nothing happened." Her words cut him deeply. Victor wanted to speak, to apologize, to try and make things right, but nothing came. "I don't have the right words," he finally said, his voice weak and heavy with despair. "I know what I did is unforgivable, and I'll never forgive myself for it, but please, Nancy, I would do anything to try and make this right." Nancy looked at him for what felt like an eternity, and then, after a long silence, she exhaled slowly and closed her eyes as if making a decision. When she opened them again, there was a subtle change, a small glimmer of something beyond pain. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you, Victor," she said honestly. "What you did was devastating. But I can see that you're trying, and maybe, just maybe, one day I can move past this. It won't be easy or quick." Victor nodded, feeling a mix of hope and sorrow. He knew the journey ahead would be grueling, but even a small chance was enough. "I'll do whatever it takes," he vowed, his voice steady with determination. "No matter how long it takes, I'll prove to you that I've truly changed, that I can be someone you might trust and perhaps forgive someday." Nancy regarded him, and for the first time, a tiny opening appeared, a beginning, if not full forgiveness. "We'll see," she said softly. "We'll see." The silence that followed was heavy, yet filled with possibility. Nancy then got up and walked toward the door, leaving Victor alone on the couch. But this time, he didn't feel the same crushing despair. He knew that although the road ahead would be long, there was at least a spark of hope. In the days after Nancy's confession, everything changed for Victor. Every word she had spoken weighed on him, a constant reminder of the pain he had caused. Rather than sinking into regret, he decided that his guilt would drive his transformation. He wasn't merely trying to win back Nancy's love. He wanted to become a man worthy of the respect of everyone he'd hurt during his ruthless career. That morning, Victor made a promise to himself. He wouldn't let the past define him. He would rebuild, starting by making amends wherever he could. He began by reaching out to the families whose lives had been shattered by his business deals. His first stop was at the home of a former competitor whose clinic he had crushed years ago. Arriving unannounced at a modest house in a neighborhood far removed from his own luxury, he knocked on the door. The man who answered looked at him with eyes full of pain and disbelief. "I'm Victor Stone," he said sincerely. "I'm here to apologize." The man stared at him for a long moment, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "Apologize? And what is that going to change?" he asked. Victor replied firmly, "I can't change the past, but I can help rebuild the future. I'm here to offer compensation and do whatever it takes to fix what I broke." Over the following weeks, Victor embarked on a journey of redemption. He knocked on doors, met with families, and offered not only money, but also his time and genuine effort to understand the damage he'd done. He started donating significant sums to small businesses affected by his corporate maneuvers and even set up recovery programs to help other entrepreneurs rebuild. Nancy watched all of this from a distance. At first, she remained cautious, observing Victor's behavior closely. She knew he was trying to change, but forgiveness was not easily earned. However, as the days turned into weeks and his transformation became undeniable, Nancy began to feel a growing respect and even a hint of admiration for him. He was changing, and his promises were no longer empty. One evening, while Nancy stood on her balcony gazing at the city lights, Victor quietly approached her. He had just returned from another reconciliation visit, and his face now held a calm, resolute look. "How did it go today, Nancy?" she asked, still staring into the distance. Victor let out a long, weary sigh, a sigh that carried months of regret and hard work. It was tough, but necessary. Every conversation, every apology, is a step toward becoming a better person. Not just for you, but for me too. Turning to meet his gaze, Nancy's eyes softened ever so slightly. "I can see that, Victor, and I'm willing to try. Maybe it's time we leave the past behind and start building something new." Victor felt a surge of relief he hadn't known he was waiting for. Those words meant more than he could express. Nancy was ready to give them a chance, not as a couple tied together by a dare, but as two real people starting fresh together. As the 6-month agreement drew to a close, something unexpected blossomed. Victor and Nancy grew closer, their conversations grew more natural, and genuine connection replaced formality. They shared laughter and began to develop a deep, sincere love that neither had anticipated. No longer were they simply bound by a contract. They were two individuals rediscovering one another in a heartfelt way. One night, as the agreed period neared its end, Victor prepared a special dinner. With a tremor in his voice, he confessed, "Nancy, our agreement is almost over, but I don't want this to end. I don't want us to part. I have fallen in love with you, truly, and I want us to continue this journey as a real couple. No more dares, no more games." Nancy looked at him, surprised by the sincerity in his tone, and her heart warmed. She realized that she too had grown to love him deeply, a feeling that had quietly built over time. "I love you, Victor," she said gently, "and I want to try to build something real with you, as equals." Those moments were filled with pure happiness. They had overcome obstacles that once seemed impossible, and now they were ready to move forward together. Months later, Nancy began to notice changes in her body. She felt sick in the mornings, a sensation she wasn't used to. It wasn't long before a checkup confirmed that she was expecting. When Nancy told Victor, his reaction was pure joy. He wrapped her in a warm embrace, laughing and crying at once. All the hardships, all the heartache they had endured now led to this moment of renewal. They were ready to start a new chapter, a life together as a family. "I want to do this right this time," Victor said with unwavering determination. "I want to marry you again. Not because of a dare, but simply because I love you and want to spend my life with you." Nancy smiled through tears of joy. "I want that too, Victor." This time, their wedding was real, a small, intimate celebration with close family and friends, free from any superficial flash or business pressure. It was just the two of them, united by genuine love and ready to face the future together. Victor knew he still had much to prove, not only to Nancy, but also to those whose lives he had ruined in his ruthless climb. Yet now he had something to fight for, a new life with the woman he loved and the child they were soon to welcome. As they danced slowly at the end of the ceremony, Nancy rested her head on Victor's chest and whispered, "Who would have thought everything started with a dare?" Victor smiled, holding her close. "Who would have guessed it would be the best dare I ever took?" With a future filled with love, redemption, and hope, they stepped into the next chapter of their lives, both left utterly speechless by the journey that had transformed them completely.